I think one thing I would like just to kind of set up, and this is the area when you think about the big picture, Stephen, when you were looking at the emerging markets. But there's gradations also within the emerging markets, as you said, as the growing middle class. And I hope that we can get into some of the discussion of, if you think about the premium market and the emerging market, then you have maybe the base of the pyramid, if you say. And perhaps there's some opportunities there that we can talk about as we look at the creative ways, both from a drug delivery and also just from a penetration into those markets of addressing those patient populations. So I guess one thing that I'd like to just offer up is you mentioned opportunities, but you also mentioned many of the challenges. Could you identify, or could maybe just we can take it from the panels themselves, how do we overcome some of the challenges, like the regulations, some of the government interactions that are going to be important in order to realize some of the opportunity gains? So if you can turn that upside down, you may actually create the opportunity by navigating that challenge. So I'll just...
Is that a question?
Yes.
So let me just start and remind you that if you look at a country like Japan, if you got a new product into Japan, you established a price that was the highest price you were ever going to get. And every year that price conceptually was going to go down about 10%. So if you look at Japan, the way you would succeed in Japan would be every year to come in with a slightly incrementally better product, because that was the only way to get a new price and a little higher, because kind of automatically the system was wired to bring the product down. So countries like Japan encourage what we kind of called incremental innovation. Countries like the United States really were developing really new, kind of brave new world products. So one of the ways that I think we will succeed in the emerging markets is through our through innovation in general, innovating both new solutions to problems and new methods of drug delivery. And so interestingly enough, many of the countries are much more concerned about efficacy, and if improved drug delivery can improve efficacy and we can prove that, we may not have to worry as much about generics or biosimilars. So I think we have to look to our innovativeness as our competitive advantage in those countries. And if we continue to truly be innovative, and that means we're going to have to be more innovative than they are. Remember, I said their R&D spending is going up and we're getting behind. If we're able to be truly innovative, both in terms of kind of new product development and in terms of new product delivery and in terms of efficacy, so that basically we're able to provide value, that is to say improve an outcome, there's a better chance that we're going to be paid for it. If you look at the business of our friends in the generics business, they're going to compete increasingly on a branded generics basis. And so one thing that most of these emerging markets have is enormous respect for brands and for things that are coming out of, quote, big companies that they kind of trust. And so we're also going to see the very powerful emergence of branding and branded products that will take away from some of the product differentiate that may actually exist.
Great.
I'll be a little bit contrarian here, because honestly, it's not at all clear to me that these countries have more challenges than we do. They just have different challenges. And I go to China. I used to go to China a couple times a year and give talks to Chinese companies about how they could enter the US market. And trust me, they are every bit as puzzled by how our market operates as we are by theirs. I guess I'd also say one other thing that we need to keep in mind, that while the growth rates are incredible and the demographics are clear and we know where we're going to be in 30, 20, 50 years maybe, it's not so clear what's going to happen in the next 5 or 6. Why do I say that? Steve, you showed a lot of charts which are absolutely true data, but if you look below them, you see something different, and I think you touched on it at the end of your presentation. If you look at the US market over the next 3 to 5 years, it's actually flat, maybe even a little down. But much of that, in fact, all of that, is driven by the huge loss of exclusivity that we have coming, the patent cliffs. If you look at the growth, worldwide growth in innovative branded pharmaceuticals in the next 3 to 5 years, 45% of it is going to come from the US. 7 times what's going to come from China. So I move right on then to how do you make money in these emerging markets with innovation? Well, brands, as Steve said, are absolutely critical. If you look at a company like Bayer, which is much bigger in China than it is in the US or even in the rest of the world, we're probably between number 3 and number 5, depending on which day it is. In China, we are in the mid-teens worldwide, and we're probably in the 20s here in the US. What you see is our ability to succeed is driven by being there early and by the strength of our brand. Branded generics are absolutely critical in most of the emerging world. Why? Because these people can't simply trust a no-name generic. The systems aren't in place for them to be able to say, if it's approved or if it's in the pharmacy, it's good. But they can trust, as long as it's not a counterfeit, that if it has a Bayer cross on it, that it's, they trust the Bayer part more than they trust the fact that it's in the store. It's the same thing with any of the other companies.
We'll leave the topic of counterfeiting out.
Yeah, we'll leave that one. So, again, I think you have to be very careful. You have to look at the needs of the market. These places are not going to be the places in the short term that are driven by the ultra-exclusive, high-end, top-end opportunities. They are looking for broad-based healthcare. They're looking for antihypertensives. They're looking for anti-infectives. They're looking for the things that, frankly, we did 20 years ago. But if you can deliver it, and you can deliver a unique way of doing it that adds value, not just price, you'll win.
Okay, maybe the view from generic company, and I had interesting discussion today in the morning, breakfast discussion with Julia Rajba-Stepp, that we are honored that all original companies are telling that we are big competition for original companies. At least Sandoz is part of Novartis, and we don't feel that we are competing with our pharma division, but anyway, we are honored still that there is a perception that we are competing with originators. And I think, Steve, you told that in US we have 75% of prescriptions for generic drugs, generic medicines, and but the value is only 20%. If we look at emerging markets, we should look, what was told before from demographic perspective, from political perspective. Epidemiology is going more and more towards the same epidemiology that we have in developed countries, but the economic status is still much, much below to what we have in other parts of the world. There is everywhere part of the population that could get very expensive medicines, but the biggest majority of population cannot afford it, and predominantly there is local production of generics that have at least questionable quality, that the outcomes are really questionable because from local producers, regulatory authorities are not requiring bioequivalence studies. Just one example. Another thing that is important also from generic company perspective is regulatory environment, and it's not the same for all companies. Local companies are having different treatment than international companies, and one of the things that is important in this respect is building partnership with regulatory authorities. And at least in our company, we are paying really very big attention to this. Without partnering, educating, helping regulatory authorities, we think there is no real bright future. And communication to authorities. One thing that, maybe as an example, that we are not only on theoretical things, is biowaiver approach. Bridging studies for some countries could be very good way how we can get approval for the drugs. And we know that this is not the model that is present right now in many countries, but this could be something that could be done. Requirements of many emerging markets are additional studies, local studies in the countries. It was recently implemented in Russia without having the CROs there. So it's what Steve mentioned before also, very often these markets are linked to a very high level of corruption. And so the question is how we can approach this. But on the other hand, there are many opportunities for generic companies like Sandoz having high quality, so the quality should be a big differentiator, and it is, and having also biosimilars that will require also new delivery devices and systems, also because of the patents that have much longer lifetime than only the basic patents. So these are opportunities, these are challenges. I think we are coping with these challenges and opportunities quite well, but one good example is that although we are having big production and big development in India, we are not selling a lot in India because we cannot compete with the very low prices of local producers there. So this is another challenge as well.
Let me just say one thing about the regulatory world. First of all, if you think about regulators in general, the gap between us in the industry and the regulators is increasing. That is to say, we as innovative industrialists are far ahead, scientifically, knowledge-wise, intellectually, ahead of where the regulatory agencies are. And that gap is causing a big problem, especially at a place like the FDA. Peggy would tell you, if you talk to her privately, the biggest problem they have at the FDA is the science gap between the regulators and the regulatees is getting bigger. So understand that because your access to foreign markets is a function of getting through those regulators, you need to, as many of us have said, spend more time with them, helping them to understand what you're trying to do, as opposed to just be frustrated that you can't get through that. The other thing to remember is that if I own a company today, and I'm building a company today, I will probably try and figure out how to get into non-US markets before I try and do it in the US. To some extent, the FDA for many things have become a black hole. It's relatively easy to get in and relatively tough to get out. So because capital is tight, companies will increasingly go to foreign markets first, try and establish their presence in foreign markets, get more patient experience, and then come to the FDA late. So we're in the process of moving the FDA from kind of being the gold standard of the world to a late adopter as new products are going to be used in markets elsewhere in the world before they come here. And so that also is a very dramatic change to our role in a global marketplace.
Maybe to that point, since it's still going to be on differentiated products, when you think about differentiated products, you think about efficacy, safety, convenience, adherence, price. Does that play out differently in those emerging markets relative to, let's say, the United States? And
plays out differently in every market.
Yeah, it is. I mean, look, I mean, I think the key is you have to know your market. You cannot assume that what sells here in the United States or the approach that works here in the United States will work in China or in Russia, because I'll tell you what, it won't. Although, let's be honest, increasingly, even here in the United States, what works in some parts and in some segments doesn't work in others. And if you are not sophisticated enough to pay attention to this, if you don't have a partner in these markets, or if you can't get into these markets and understand them well, then you do have a challenge, because it's not a cookie-cutter approach. It will not work.
Let me just expand on that for 1 minute in the United States, because we as an industry are fairly naive about who our customers are. If in fact the insurance companies are by and large paying for that, let's assume it's Aetna for a minute. And in contrast, if you assume that your customer is somebody like the Kaiser Permanente healthcare system, the people in the Kaiser plan are in there on average 20 years. The people in an Aetna plan may be in there on average 2 or 3 years. Aetna's not going to pay for things where they can basically avoid the long-term cost. And so there's enormous cost shifting. And so we have this kind of naive view that all the customers in the United States are the same. All we got to do is prove that we create value and we're going to be able to recover it. That's not true in our country. And this industry is just beginning to learn the nuances of how difficult it is to get paid. Not how difficult it is to get through the regulators, but how difficult it actually is to get paid for what we're doing. If you then expand that on a global scale, as Chris has indicated, it is even more complex because you've got to understand the nuances of the healthcare system and what their priorities are and how doctors get paid and how pharmacists get paid and how the system actually works and who the customer really is. And we're blinded by our American view of how those systems work. So we have this kind of view that the rest of the world works like we do. It doesn't have anything to do with it. And so the need then for local partners and local expertise and local knowledge, not just about how your drug works, but how the diabetes is treated or how cardiovascular is treated or whether the pharmacist actually, or whether the doctor actually gets paid through the pharmacy product. So if you look at some countries, the way doctors get paid is by prescribing medicine. So Japan has 10x the use of pharmaceuticals the US does because the medical professionals are basically get paid through the pharmacy profit. So you have to understand the nuances of these in every single country and really for every single disease. It's not kind of one size fits all.
And just to add one little thing to that, China is not China is not China. When you go to Shanghai or Beijing, it's very different than when you go to some of the second or third tier cities in the interior. And by the way, these are huge markets. I mean, you're talking over 100 cities with over 1 million population that nobody in here has ever heard about. And it's a different market than when you go to the mega cities on the coast.
It's valid for other countries as well. We should know that in Russia, 70% at least of the money is concentrated in Moscow and not elsewhere, like in Siberia. But my company and the company that was acquired by Novartis, we are in Russia for more than 40 years. And it's very often about building relationship. Without building the right relationship with authorities, with physicians, with patients' organizations, it's even for generics very hard to succeed. Although we are bringing known medicines to the market, but still it's a lot of building relationships and having what was said before, branded generics. It's very, very important.
And size matters in these markets.
Let me just share with you something to give you a scale. In the United States today, we have 10 metropolitan areas that have 10 million people, more or less. In China, we're creating one city of 1 million people every 2 weeks. So the scale of population growth is hard for us to understand. China is growing so fast. A city like Shenzhen didn't exist 20 years ago, 25 million people today. And so the nuances of China, it's not, as indicated, one country, it's a whole bunch of kind of local fiefdoms with local rules and local dynamics. But the absolute scale of population growth outside of the United States dwarfs your ability to understand.
We have a question from the...
Yes, I'm Martin Woodle. I'm a nanotechnology targeting delivery system company. And everything I've heard sounds like the market, those markets are not based on a foundation that has been historical for supporting the pharma industry in the West, which has been IP stability and protection of products. And so I'm wondering if that's, in fact, the situation that those marketplace, the industry foundation is not going to be based on intellectual property other than freedom to operate, and has many other aspects associated with it in terms of being able to get into that market and truly practice. And so the other part of my question is, how does one use innovation in that sort of a place? And it seems to me that learning to do it in the emerging markets is going to help us, because I foresee patent support for pharma declining in the US as well.
I think one thing is certain, right? The path that in particular, the big emerging markets, the one, the BRICS that are growing really fast, are going to take over the next 30 years. It's not going to look like a mirror image of the development of the industry in the developed world in the past 30 or 50 years. It's going to be different. But I wouldn't say that it's not going to have some similar characteristics. At the end of the day, all of these countries are starting to realize that without a strong legal and financial system foundation, and without some IP foundation, they really are not going to be able to do what they want. Having said that, it's messy. And of course, I'm going to say the obvious thing, which is that it's tough for a small company to figure it out, and you should look for a good partner like us to do it for you. But it is the obvious thing, but it is also true, to be quite candid. It is very difficult for a little company to decide that it's going to pick up and enter, and you know, China's the one everybody talks about, but frankly, Russia is in some ways more opaque. You know, and India is a whole different scale of complexity. It's difficult. It's difficult for big companies. So really, you know, I think you need a good partner if you're going to really exploit these countries. Well, stop.
So one thing about IP protection around the world, as Chris indicated, it's different. The real issue has a lot more to do with enforcement. Most of these countries, including China, have signed the WTO, and so they all have agreed to basically respect intellectual property, but there's virtually no enforcement. Look at Viagra in every street corner in China. So it isn't a function of whether you get a patent, it is a function of whether or not you can actually have the muscle to protect it and whether the government in any way is going to help you enforce it. And I think you would be naive to assume that you're going to have a lot of protection. There are many countries where you will have protection, but if you look at most of these countries, you're not going to win on an IP basis, you're going to win on some kind of a market advantage. Your challenge will be to be able to innovate faster than somebody can copy what you're doing. And if you continue to innovate at a faster rate, you'll be all right, but if you're going to try and live off old innovation, you'll be in trouble.
Would this be a place where innovative generics comes in? In other words, you have the brand image, but you add an innovative twist to it.
It's a challenge for, let's say, generic companies coming from regulated world, because we tend to respect all the patents, and so if we are competing with the companies that are not respecting this, they can be much, much cheaper. And so this is the challenge, but then the differentiator could be again the quality, because very often the quality is very, very questionable. We know this because we are testing the products as well from other companies. Okay. But the patent landscape itself, it's anyway important also for generic companies, because we are patenting processes, we are patenting what was told before. Teva patented formulation, and AstraZeneca sued Teva. Well, it was patent dispute on this. So it's a very important area, and at least in Sandoz, we are filing more than 50 patent applications every year. So we want also to protect our intellectual property, but this is the area that is improving for sure, but not improving with the same pace in all countries, in all emerging countries.
I think we also have to think about not only branded generics, but OTC. Mm-hmm. And many of the things that we think are going to be branded generics, if you look at the new Lipitor strategy, a big hunk of the Lipitor strategy is OTC. Mm-hmm. And so it's a little more complex than just ethical drugs and generics and branded generics. A lot of markets are basically OTC markets.
And let's not forget, OTC is a brand name.
Right.
Aspirin is well over 100 years old. It's still a big product. It's a brand everywhere in the world except here. In the United States, it's a generic name. Outside the United States, you cannot buy aspirin that's not Bayer aspirin. And Bayer aspirin.
So I'll tell you a funny story. So a number of years ago, when Syntex was doing its deal with Procter & Gamble, Naprosyn was Syntex product. It's now Aleve as a Procter & Gamble product. The presidents of these two...
Sorry, it's a Bayer.
Sorry. President of Procter & Gamble and president of Syntex, Paul Freeman, were having dinner. I was with him. And in the middle of dinner, the president of Procter & Gamble leaned over and said to Paul, he said, I really can't understand your industry. How can you spend $500 million developing a product and never get that to marketplace? And just as quickly, Paul turned to the president of Procter & Gamble and said, I don't understand your market. I don't know how you can spend $500 million on an ad for dancing raisins and make any money. And so what you realize is that the consumer product, branded product marketing world is an entirely different world than the world of kind of proprietary product. And we're coming off an industry that by and large has built our value off innovation of proprietary product, and we're moving into a world of branded products. And branded products and protecting a brand, certainly if you look at Bayer as a wonderful example of that, that brand has been extraordinarily valuable to that company for its entire existence. And so the power of brands is entirely different than the power of IP.
And I think it's true that in the emerging markets, you really are seeing a merging of the innovation pipeline from the classic pharma biotech industry and the consumer brand side. And I think that's really what will be powerful in many of these markets, that combination.
Question?
Okay. Can I just change track for just a second? One of the things involved with drug delivery and pharmaceuticals is the packaging and specialized materials that go into it. Brought into a very early phase. How do you see the packaging and materials companies changing in order to keep up with the changes that are going on in the industry that we're talking about today?
So let me talk about technology for a minute, because if you look at something like Proteus, we can put in the front of a pill a little microfluidics chip, biodegradable integrated circuit, that when you swallow your pill, you know what's actually going on. You also have tremendous amount of technology today that you can put on the top of a pill bottle of various things, on-body and in-body sensors in which we can understand compliance. And so I think we're going to think totally differently about packaging and what information we're able to gather through that whole end of the spectrum, that we're just beginning to see new technology change the nature of that business.
Actually, I agree with that, but I would have to say, my R&D people hate when I go to these meetings because I tend to say what I think. But as an industry, we've been absolutely terrible at thinking outside of the box or the little white pill bottle. It's all about the pill or the injectable or the biologicals. And frankly, I really don't see a lot of innovation, at least in big pharma, that looks outside of that context. And I think there is a great deal that could be done. I mean, the examples you gave with the iPhone app, I mean, there's all kinds of stuff you could do. And we're just not there yet.
I think the other thing to remember, I think we all know it in this room, this is a country that has a lot of consumer direct advertising. In most countries, you can't do that, and most countries won't allow us to do that, and so that also enters into the equation about how it's packaged and what the claims are and the ability to get that communicated through the system.
But this is the opportunity for generic companies for sure as well. For example, we have in our oncology injectable division, we have OncoSafe packaging that is really kind of differentiator. It's very friendly for health professionals, and this is something that should develop also in the future, and this is something that we can use it for not really any big extra cost also in emerging markets, and we are doing this already.
I think as all of you know, compliance is one of our biggest problems. That improved packaging and other things can really improve compliance, which can improve outcomes dramatically. So I think that we're talking a lot about innovation in the context of product, but I think we'll see extraordinary innovation in the context of packaging and delivery.
It's certainly needed. It's coming, and it's there, but it's slow when you compare, frankly, to other industries.
Yeah, and it's interesting because in drug development, packaging needs to be specified early on because of stability issues. But packaging isn't really talked about very much. So I guess that's where I'm coming. I obviously work in the packaging industry in the pharmaceuticals. So what I'm trying to get at is, I know that marketing is certainly one part of packaging, but so is the technical part in terms of stability, maintaining efficacy, and all those things that have to do with supporting the drugs that it's packaging or that it is delivering to the person.
I guess the question I have when I hear that, though, is, if I put on my finance hat and I'm looking at an early development, the question I have is, okay, is that packaging going to help me differentiate my product in either efficacy, safety, or cost? And we still have a lot of people whose idea of, wonderful package innovation is something child safe that nobody over the age of 35 can open, but every 12-year-old can. It's not clear to me that without a holistic approach that starts from the very beginning, that simply adding packaging is going to be something that we're going to be able to predict the value of going down the road.
Okay.
I think that's one of the hang-ups that the industry has today. Is, true innovation in that regard is, okay, it's going to cost us money, it's going to be different, but what is it going to do when I take it to market?
Yeah, and I guess my question is, sitting through these lectures, is, this is a huge industry. It's changing dramatically. What do corresponding industries need to do to keep up? Are there partnership opportunities? I don't know the answer to the question. That's why I'm asking.
So I want you all to think differently about drug delivery, because if you think about spitting on your cell phone and having a little microfluidics chip that tells you what's actually wrong with you from some doctor and knowledge base elsewhere in the world, and it will not only tell you what's wrong with you, but what's going to fix you, and you think about delivery in the context of a little FedEx truck that's on its way out there to bring you the product that's going to fix the world, we're going to see changes not only in drug and drug development and therapeutic outcomes, but you're going to see changes coming from an entirely different world of technology that's going to change the nature of things like packaging and delivery. And we haven't even begun to appreciate how the communications revolution is going to change all of this. So we do have the microfluidics chips today that can do that. We do have the smartphones that can do that. I showed you in my own iPhone what you can do, and we're just beginning to understand how, as we connect all those things, the roles of the FedExes of the world will transform the roles of pharmacies and hospitals. And if you're on the board today of a hospital and you're thinking about a $500 million expansion that's going to be good for the next 10 years, you got to think about how all of this technology is going to change the nature of that, because you're going to have patients come in, they're going to go to surgery centers, they're going to go across the street, stay in the Four Seasons for a night, they're going to have in-body and on-body sensors, and you're going to have companies connected with their patients and things delivered on a different way. And so we think about the healthcare world in the sickness world context. So our definition of healthcare is a dysfunctional sickness care system. But you have to understand we're going to an increasingly effective wellness care system where we can be fairly predictive, we can be fairly preemptive, and we're going to treat patients differently where we actually know what's wrong with them, and we've got treatments that are going to be effective. And the pharmaceutical world will get there kicking and screaming, but the technologies outside of our industry are going to transform everything that we're doing.
Just to maybe directly say one thing about your question, I think the implication of the way you asked the question is that, we have some gurus sitting inside pharma who are going to be able to tell you the answer to this and what to do. As a practical matter, it's the other way around, right? What's needed is, if you have a great idea, you got to find a way to come forward and access the right people in our organizations and explain to them what the opportunity is. Because certainly in the case of packaging and product supply, their job is very focused. Yeah. And it's got to be delivered with absolute consistency. I don't care whether you're generic or your brand, consistency, right cost, etc. Yeah. The innovation in that space is probably going to come from you, not the other way around.
That's what I wanted to hear. So, there's a lot of things going on, but I just wanted to see how the businesses can work together. So thank you for the answer.
Remember that we spend more money in this country on fitness clinics than we do on doctors. So we have to understand how rapidly the system is changing around us. We live in a world where we used to get sick, we went to our doctor, we did a test, they prescribed a medicine that presumably worked. That is not the world that we're going to live in relatively few years. And so it's changing so fast in the pharmaceutical industry, ugly as it is to admit, is living in yesterday's knowledge base. And so we're still trying to invent better molecules or better biologics in a system that's moved very, very rapidly around new technology that's going to preempt disease, and we're going to spend most of our money on the wellness side trying to preempt disease rather than on the sickness side somehow dysfunctionally trying to treat disease. That's a massive change in the world that we live in.
But emerging markets are far away from
That's right.
this.
That I agree.
So it's
That will clearly happen in the developed markets ahead of the emerging markets. But don't forget that a lot of that technology will hit the markets in places like Sweden, which have a much more integrated healthcare system because you can extract the value of that than they will in the United States. So while we talk about the developed markets, it doesn't necessarily mean the U.S. is going to be the first markets to do that.
Question?
This question to Steve. That's an excellent talk. Just wanted to see if you could elaborate the model what you have given on Facebook, Twitter model of the pharma industry in the future. If we cannot count on the selling at a higher price, but you need to increase your revenues, how you see that? How you can elaborate relevant to pharma industry?
You wanted to elaborate on how do we use the Facebook, Twitter model that you showed in healthcare?
So if you look at a system like Twitter today and Facebook, those are by and large open systems. So you can go in today with data mining software. There's a company called Swarmology that does data mining in those systems, and you can figure out today absolutely everybody who's talking about diabetes. At this minute, you can figure out everybody who's talking about diabetes. You can take those analytics and you can sell them to Lilly or Novo or other people who have treatments for diabetes. And so you're going to be able to use technology today to change the nature of both what the pharmaceutical industries know and what their customers are doing. And you have to remember that most of us in the pharmaceutical industry are by and large disconnected with the actual customer. We know the solution we're trying to have, but we actually don't know the actual person that's using it. And so in that world of new informatics, you're going to see value created differently. Google is less than 10 years old. Facebook is less than 7 years old. Twitter is less than 5 years old. And I would argue that the companies that may be the dominant companies 5 and 10 years from now aren't well-known names. Now, they want to be, and the question I started with is, can the people that we know and love change fast enough in a marketplace that creates a whole new series, a whole new paradigm? And so there are a lot of people out there that are in the business of dramatic change to what we call our healthcare system, and it's not apparent today, if you were a student of all of this, that the Bayers or the Sandoz/Novartises are going to be the dominant players 5 and 10 years from now, 20 years from now. They want to be, and the question is, can they morph their business around faster than I can create a new one? So I think we're going to learn to think differently about value creation and value extraction, and it's not always going to be margin in the product.
I agree with that. I mean, not about the part that we're going to disappear. We've been called dinosaurs for a long time, but I just want to remind everybody that the dinosaurs were around for hundreds of millions of years, and a lot of small mammals while we were around. So.
And they ate for lunch.
That's right. But I think really where I see the opportunity going forward is not dissimilar to what Steve said. The big problem pharmaceuticals companies have, one big problem is actually we have a lot of data about our products and our products on clinical trials. We actually don't have nearly as much data as we could if there was an effective way for us to find out what happens to people who actually take it. Not the 10,000 or 30,000 in a huge trial or set of trials, but the 30 million who took it. And you're starting to see the beginnings of this. There's a little company called 23andMe that's doing, they will sequence your genome for $100 plus $10 a month for the foreseeable future. They've actually got an interesting business model starting, which is they got a few 100,000 or 150,000 people sequenced who are self-reporting. If we can find a way where that kind of thing expands, where we can get access to that data, where we can know, geez, what's your genome like? What's your disease state like? Do you take our drug? We don't need to know your name. We don't want to know your name. But we would love to know how that all works, because then we can really start to craft some interesting solutions.
So if you try and figure out why Roche decided to bet $6 billion on Illumina, that's part of the answer.
Yep.
It's a big bet. I had dinner last night with Jeff Kinlan, former CEO of Pfizer. He thinks they're nuts, but I think Roche is probably right.
Question?
So my name is Trishul, and I represent a contract manufacturer for peptides, and we actually have facilities, 2 facilities in California, 3 in Europe, and we actually have a facility in India, a new facility out there. So my question is actually related more to the manufacturing end of healthcare. And that's what we're based off of. Now, recently there was an article from Boston Consulting about how pay and how the middle class is increasing in China, India, and emerging markets. Eventually, in about, I think it was 2015, they were saying pay for skilled labor would be almost equivalent to the US, and in some cases, in states such as Alabama, it'll actually be lower there. And their prediction is manufacturing base will start moving back to the US. How do you see that? That's almost like leveling of the playing field that I think, Steve, you're talking about in your talk, and how do you see that affecting the opportunities in the emerging markets, or how does the dynamics change altogether within this industry, if that does happen?
Well, certainly one of the big items to understand is the use of technology in manufacturing. So we have almost eliminated people from the manufacturing process. So the people cost of manufacturing was always a major hunk of it. And so that advantage, that arbitrage advantage where you had lower cost people, have disappeared. So technology is a great leveler there. And if you can get it done in Germany or the United States or Poland or any place, it's not going to be a function of the cost of labor, but it's going to be a function of use of technology. The other thing is, if you want to do business in Russia, you probably manufacture in Russia. You listen to Putin and the boys that you work with today, they want Russian pharmaceuticals, but they want them made in Russia. So we're going to find companies like these and others are going to increasingly distribute manufacturing around the world. They look more like fill finish, but they're going to distribute manufacturing around the world, because in order to sell to the government customers, they want to know that you're doing something to create some value and employ some people in those countries.
Yeah, I'd agree with that, but I have difficulty believing that we're going to see the manufacturing base, especially the labor-intensive manufacturing base, move back to the U.S. I would say 2 things to it. First of all, if you again look at China, and it's one I'm quite familiar with, costs are rising, but costs are rising on the coast. And what you are seeing, these people move incredibly quickly. It is a pure state of nature. And I'll tell you, the costs go up, some small increment in Shanghai, then there's another city 50 miles away where the costs aren't high. They will keep moving. The other thing is, that's China. There's a whole world out there of people who would love this work and who, at the end of the day, as China gets richer, are going to be willing to do it for a fraction of what the Chinese are going to do it. Let's not forget that 30, 40 years ago, Japan was a low-cost producer, right? So it's not going to stop. It's not going to stop.
Yeah, and China is for sure not anymore the low-cost country. And but what was said before, yeah, there will be political pressures as well on this. In Russia, almost every pharmaceutical company will need to be present with the production facilities. So it's clear this is the development there, and we can't change it, even if we don't want to have another production facility there, but it's the fact. And there will be other countries, now Bangladesh, Indonesia, so there are many countries that are already production sites for all pharmaceutical companies, not only for generics.
So we have a company that's doing business in the Middle East, and you go even to small Middle Eastern countries and you want to sell, and the government will say, we'll buy it, but you have to make it or do something in our country that employs some people. And so countries are using, as I said, they're erecting barriers and making it more difficult. So you're not going to see all the products made in some low-cost area and shipped around the world. You're going to see things like manufacturing distributed all over the world.
Question?
I really enjoyed the concept about the diagnostic and pharmaceutical products bringing value together. You said pharma will wrap around diagnostics. I might challenge a little bit and say that a diagnostic with no cure doesn't have any value either. So I think it might be at the interface of the two. So several questions. One is, what does that mean for the business model in diagnostics? I was in that industry some years ago. I'm sure it's changing. So that's probably the biggest question. And then as that drives us to wellness, a wellness industry, is that a consumer industry? Does insurance play a role in that? Who's going to pay for our wellness as we constantly self-monitor? And then somebody decides someday we're going to go to the doctor and get a drug that I guess the government is going to pay for. That's what's going through my head, so maybe I have it wrong.
You will always pay for your medicine. How you pay for it may be a slightly different question, right?
Yeah.
If you're going to pay for it directly, you're going to pay for it in insurance rates, or you're going to pay for it in taxes.
Yeah.
And I don't care what system you're in. This is something I think we here sometimes forget when we talk about socialized medicine and blah, blah, blah. They're paying for it. They pay for it in their taxes. In Canada, you pay for it in your taxes. In the UK, in Germany, we pay for it through insurance companies. You're going to pay for it. That's the one.
It just depends on the who's the middleman in there,
and how
right?
many of them are there.
And so is the beauty of the diagnostics becoming affordable that we cut out a lot of the middle, and people buy their own quality of care directly, or are we really sophisticated enough to do that for ourselves? These are just some of the thoughts that bubble up when you talk about.
Let me just take a few shots. First of all, if you think about the healthcare systems around the world, they haven't changed very much in 2,000 years. So 2,000 years ago, disease happened, and you went to some kind of a local healer, and they didn't work very effective, and people died. If you think about the healthcare systems all over the world today, they're by and large the same. We have an episodic healthcare. We wait for something to happen. We try and figure out what it is. We try and do something. Still a lot of people die. And we have better technology to identify disease. We have better technology to treat disease. But by and large, we have an episodic healthcare system, and it's expensive. It's going to be a lot cheaper for the world to keep people well than it is to treat the sick people. Now, maybe we're going to have to give everybody a right to live to 100, then we're going to shoot them because we can't keep everybody alive forever. But as copays went up, people were suddenly more interested in the cost of healthcare and began to move to a more fit. If you look at the employers today, the employers have massive programs to keep their population more fit and reduce the cost, because by keeping their population more well, they dramatically increase the cost on the sickness side. So don't underestimate the power of the move from this dysfunctional, expensive sickness care system we have to an increasingly personalized, predictive, preemptive healthcare system, which you're going to see in our lifetime. And in that regard, all of this new technology that my friends and I are developing is going to be transformative, not only to the diagnosis, but the predictiveness of what's going to happen. We're going to see massive economics move away from the treatment of disease to the maintenance of wellness. The doctors of the world today make their money on treating sick people. They're by and large extraordinary perverse incentives in the world. 22% of the GDP in the United States is on healthcare. Those people don't want to vote themselves off the island quickly. And so we have enormous kind of intrinsic power to keep the system the way it is, and it's totally dysfunctional. And in a relatively short period of time, you'll see this quantum leap. It isn't going to wipe out these companies because they're smart and they're going to change too. But don't get lost in the world of kind of RX here as high value, high margin products. DX are kind of commodity products that don't have anything. You're going to see the DX drive the RX world, and the DX, you've already seen in places like cancer care. You look at people like Genomic Health. People said to me years ago, nobody's going to pay $3,500 for a diagnostic that's going to be predictive of your cancer recurrence. You can look at Genomic Health today transforming that world. You can look at somebody like XDX that's got a product for AlloMap, which is for heart transplant rejection. Very, very important product. It is a blood test instead of something where you do 10 biopsies a year to find out whether your heart's going to reject. But the problem is that the hospitals in the United States, their biggest profit center is biopsies. And so they're going to keep doing biopsies even though there's a better solution out there. So to really understand the answer to your question, you have to understand all the perversion in the healthcare systems today, and that's going to take a while to change. But if you look back 20 years from now, you'll be amazed at how rapidly that changed. And technology is our friend, and technology is going to change us faster than you can believe, and that's why I use my Google examples. People in this room don't know how rapidly technology is moving to a different world from the world that we've had that largely been the same for the last couple thousand years.
And much faster than every politician in every political party in this country, all of whom are talking about a model from the 1950s and 60s, frankly.
And that's why healthcare reform at the Supreme Court level really doesn't matter. The marketplace is moving very, very fast. You just look at the technology you have on your cell phone today, and you think about that. It's interesting, I was involved in the start of Apple 25 years ago, and if you look at what we were able to do to take things the size of this room, and in 25 years move it to this in our pocket today, because the cost of information came down. The cost in our world per bit of biological information is going down logarithmically faster. And if we were able to go from boxcar-sized computers to this in 25 years in the electronics world, you can't even begin to understand how different the healthcare equation is going to be in the next 25 years when our cost per bit of information is coming down logarithmically faster.
Well, why don't we take this as the last question?
I'd like to follow up on that. I agree that the prevention will be a lot cheaper, but there's two major barriers to it that affect biology, are much more problematic than the technology, and that is learning what makes for a healthier lifestyle is not easy, and the research in that is very difficult. The effort for prevention of cancer is trivial at NIH compared to the effort around treatment of cancer. The other problem is, even when healthy lifestyle is understood, humans rarely will adopt those. I'm a testament. And so those problems will be major impediments to this, but the technology may allow us to overcome some of those impediments, collecting the data that allows for what would be normally an incredibly expensive clinical trial to learn what stops cancer.
So let me give you an example, and I'm going to agree with you. If you look at smoking, we took smoking, we have absolute knowledge it's bad for you. You can know all the clinical results of smoking. It leads to premature death, all these ugly diseases. We have taken package of cigarettes, we've put in ugly pictures, we've put in smoking kills, we've done everything in the world to tell people this is bad, and we've moved smoking in this country from 26% of the population to 21%. It's had almost no impact. So you're right, there's a giant gap between what we know and how we behave. So if I tell you you've got an 86% chance you're going to have Alzheimer's, that's interesting, but are you going to change things to fix that? So there is a giant psychological thing, but what you will find is the payers of the world, including yourself, will drive you to different behaviors. And so it'll be a lot cheaper to pay to stay well than it will be to pay for sickness. So the economic equation you have today, the population of the United States has had no economic cost of their sickness. They pay a little bit of insurance, or their employer does, or the government does, but they don't bear the cost. As co-pays go up, they're suddenly worried about it. And so you can see the economic equation beginning to change that, and that will drive it the other direction. But you're right, psychology is still working against it.
There is one other reality, though, which is we are all going to die, and it would be a terrible thing, for example, to die of low cholesterol. So I still eat beef, right? Because I want to enjoy life while I have it.
Why don't we bring that to a close? That was a good finish, and I'd like to first thank the audience for your active participation. And also, please join me in thanking our distinguished panel for a very enjoyable discussion.